Michelle Liu, is consciousness a physical process?
It seems not.
So, I recently put on my Substack an article entitled Will Science Ever Explain Consciousness? And what I was trying to do in that article was articulate an argument we find in the academic literature that's become known as the revelation argument. And this argument tries to show that being conscious, which is just to say having feelings and experiences, can't possibly consist in patterns of neural firings. Now, Michelle, you're one of the leading exponents of this argument. You've written some of the most interesting contributions to this literature. So I thought
Thank you.
you're very welcome. So I thought it would be a good idea to have you on to explain this argument to our audience and help them evaluate it for themselves. What do you think about
Oh,
this?
thanks for having me.
Brilliant. Okay, so let's get straight to it. So, can you explain to our audience, quite simply, what is the revelation argument against physicalism?
I don't know if I can explain it simply, but let's start by thinking about our conscious experience, right? So we can have direct access to our conscious experience. We can introspect our conscious experience. So revelation is this idea that we know the nature of our experiences just by having the experience. So this might sound really, really abstract, but let me give you a concrete example, which might be helpful. So I was recently stung by a jellyfish for the very first time.
Oh,
So I
wow.
live in Australia. This is the end of summer. So I've been spending the summer snorkeling. So on this particular day, the water was very, very calm and I was enjoying myself. And all of a sudden, I felt this excruciating pain on my face. I was really nervous
Oh
because,
my
again,
God.
I live in Australia. All sorts of things can be venomous. And I only started swimming in the ocean quite recently. So I quickly swam to shore and asked for help. And then I was told I was stung by a lion's mane jellyfish. It's a type of jellyfish. It's kind of pinkish. Um, so now thinking about that experience, right? So thinking about what it's like to be stung by a lion's mane jellyfish, um, you know, there was so much I didn't know about that experience. At least when I first had that experience, there was so much I didn't know. I didn't know what caused the experience. I didn't see anything, coming my way. I didn't know what kind of effect it was going to have on me, right? But there was something I knew very well, namely what the feeling is like. I knew what being stung by a lion's mane jellyfish felt like. I knew the nature. Now I've had experience. I knew the nature of that feeling. I know what defines that feeling, right? So if you ask me what exactly is that feeling, what do I know about that feeling? Well, I probably will struggle, right? I will struggle to explain, right? It's kind of like being stung by a bee, but it's also different. And but I don't think I have words to describe the difference. But just because I don't know how to describe my knowledge, that doesn't mean I don't know what it's like to be stung by a lion's mane jellyfish. I know so well, I know what defines the feeling. Now I have all sorts of abilities, right? I can sit here and record experience, right? I can imagine experience. I can definitely recognize the feeling if I get stung again, right? So revelation is this idea that when we think about our conscious experiences in terms of how they feel from the inside, when we focus on these feeling aspects, these kind of subjective, kind of first personal aspects, these qualitative aspects, we know the nature of our experiences, right? So we have rich knowledge about our conscious experiences just in virtue of having them, and this knowledge reveals the nature, the essence of our experiences. So
Hmm.
that's kind of the idea of revelation.
So that's the intuition of revelation. I mean, in a way, I like to put it really simply by just saying a feeling is defined by how it feels. And you know how it
That's right.
feels, and you know how it feels when you feel it. Now, it doesn't mean you. I don't think. Well, I'd be interested to know what you think on this. I don't think we have to say we completely grasp exactly how it feels, all aspects of it, all the details. I mean, there's a big discussion in the literature actually about what Ned Block calls overflow. That's his name for there might be certain details of our experience that we don't have cognitive access to. It sounds kind of contradictory at first. How can it be part of your experience if you don't have any access to it cognitively? But actually there is empirical evidence, for example, to do with change blindness that seems to suggest that. But anyway, whatever you think of that debate, we don't have to settle on that. The way I like to put the thesis of revelation is, insofar as we grasp what it's like or how it feels, to that extent we grasp the essence, right? So we don't have to say we completely grasp what it's like, we completely grasp how it feels, but insofar as we do, we grasp the essence. What do you think about that way of putting that?
I think that seems right. And I think, what we grasp is really the core aspects of the feeling, right? So there's maybe the experience is so complicated that, at least we don't have, we can't really describe the structure of the experience very well, but there's something kind of the core essence that we describe, we can grasp. But I think with revelation, I like to focus on very simple cases. I like to focus on very simple sensations rather than complex visual experience. Say this computer screen, the visual experience of this computer screen is really complicated. I like to focus on very simple experience, looking at a particular shade of color or having a particular pain sensation or itch sensation, right? And so something that seems rather simple, I think, and then you only have to focus on these experiences to run an argument against physicalism.
Yeah, so it's nice to just focus on those very simple cases, and if it works there, then maybe we can get our argument going. You used a word there in your answer before the last one, the word essence. And maybe people will be thinking, well, that seems a very mysterious, metaphysical word, essence. Do you have an easy way of explaining what you mean by essence?
Yeah, I think, think in terms of, not the words nature, but maybe nature is not particularly helpful either. I think what defines something, like the definition, so think about words having definitions, things maybe, there's something to their nature, their definition, what defines that thing. What makes this thing the thing it is. Think about a triangle, right? What's a triangle? A triangle is a closed shape with three sides. That defines a triangle, I think. So it's think in terms of definition would be quite helpful.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I don't think it is such a mysterious idea, really.
I think folks do have the concept of essence. We can chat more about this.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to get into, whether this is something ordinary people have an easy access to. But I mean, just giving examples, like when as you said though, what it is to be a triangle, it's to be a three-sided figure. Whereas other things, take for example scientific categories like water or lightning, we might not know instantly its essence. Like what is it for something to be water? What is it for something to be lightning? You might think it's the anger of the gods. You might think water is a fundamental element together with earth, fire, and wind. Is they the four elements the ancient Greeks thought? So we with these things, we don't know what it is to be water or to be lightning until we do some science. But with mathematical concepts, like what is it to be a triangle, you don't need to do some science to know that it's a three-sided figure. But not just mathematical concepts. I think maybe a party. I always like to give the example. What is it to have a party? I think it's harder to nail down the exact definition that it is with a triangle, because it's a messy, ordinary language concept. But you know what it is to have a party. It's roughly, people getting together, dancing, drinking. So I don't think this is necessarily a mysterious notion. But yeah, let's drag us back to consciousness. I mean, people might be thinking this just sounds totally like a truism, uncontroversial, that how pain feels when you feel it, and that's what a feeling is. So why would anyone disagree with this? Why is this a problem for a physicalist?
Oh wow, I think people disagree with this with revelation. It's because revelation actually is incompatible with physicalism. So Physicalism is the claim that roughly everything is physical, everything can be reduced to things that feature in the physical sciences. So in terms of consciousness, a physicalist would typically say that the conscious experience is just some neurophysiological process in the brain, right? Now, the example that philosophers like to use is pain and C fibers firing. Really, the feeling of pain is these fibers firing in your brain. Now, revelation is the idea that, well, just by having an experience, you know the nature of experience, you know what they are, right? Now, physicalism says that, you know, the feeling of a pain is just C fibers firing in the brain, right? So if you assume revelation, then that means when I have my experience, since I know the nature, I ought to know that my feeling is C fibers firing in the brain. I ought to know, you know, these firings in my neuron firings in my brain. But I think everyone can agree that when we're having any experience, right, we're totally unaware of anything going on inside our brain, right? We certainly don't know that specific neurons are firing. So if revelation is true, then at least, you know, it looks like physicalism is false.
Right, that was very nicely articulated. So let me just repeat it back to you to make sure we're on the same page of how we're understanding this argument. So the thought is, if I know what, so I've got my feeling. I'm so sorry about that jellyfish. Was it very painful?
Oh, that's all right. You know, it's a valuable experience.
Was it incredibly painful?
I think it was more scary at the time, you know, because I just didn't know the cause. And there are species of jellyfish which are deadly in Australia, and some are extremely venomous. And the type I was stung by wasn't particularly bad, so I was lucky.
So do you have to treat it in any way? Or sorry, slight digression here.
Ice pack. I only got stung by, I think, a fragment of it, not even like a whole jellyfish, just a fragment, probably a fragment that broke off. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so coming back to your jellyfish experience, just because it's a nice concrete example. So you're saying you know, to a large extent at least, the nature of that feeling, because it's a feeling, it's defined by how it feels, and you know how it feels. So just as we know what it is for something to be a triangle, it's to be a three-sided figure, you know what it is to have that feeling. So then the physicalist comes along and says, well, for you to have that feeling is for you to have some pattern of neural firings. Yeah, so you said philosophers often give this example, C fibers firing. It's from Saul Kripke, I think, is in his influential book, Naming a Necessity. And it is a real brain state. I don't think anyone says it's...
I think it's quite accurate, yeah.
Yeah, no one says it perfectly corresponds to pain. It's sort of involved in pain. But anyway, it's a sort of placeholder for whatever science tells us ultimately pain is. There's never-ending controversy in the science of consciousness, but we're pretending C fibers firing is the name for this brain state that neuroscientists showed us is what pain is. And so the neuroscientists said, for you to feel pain is for your C fibers to be firing. But that can't be true because you already know what it is for you to feel this particular feeling. And it's being C fibers firing, this pattern of neural firing, that didn't show up in your knowledge of its essence.
That's right. Yeah.
It's like neuroscience would be too easy, wouldn't it? If we could just attend to our... Yeah. So you grasp the nature. If it had a physical nature, you'd know that introspectively as you attend to and you grasp its nature, but you didn't, so it can't have a physical nature.
That's right.
Roughly, yeah. Well, that seems completely conclusive. Should we leave it there? Is that seems a completely knockdown argument against physicalism? Presumably, everybody agrees with this.
Oh, not physicalists, of course.
Okay. Well, so how on earth so this does seem. Yeah, it seems an intuitive starting point. The link to the falsity of physicalism seems pretty clear. So let's just lay it out one more time, because I think I got a bit muddled in how I explained that. So the thought is, maybe we should have done a premise conclusion. So we grasp the nature of the feeling just by attending to it introspectively.
Yeah, that's revelation. Yeah.
If it had a physical nature, you'd know it through attending to it, and that's given revelation.
Yeah.
But you don't no physical nature
It
through
doesn't have a
attending to
physical
it,
nature.
so it can't have a physical nature. So that's the rough structure.
That's
So it's an intuitive starting point. The link to the falsity of physicalism seems fairly clear. So how do physicalists respond to this? Well, maybe we could take it in two steps. So I suppose let's start with the starting point of revelation. Seems pretty intuitive. Do physicalists deny this, and how might they deny it?
I think most physicalists do say explicitly that revelation is very intuitive. I actually don't know anyone, or not a physicalist. I don't, well, not on record at least. But I think most physicalists would agree that this is a very intuitive thesis. They might think, different versions are intuitive to a different extent, but I think most of them would say they're intuitive. And a good example is David Papineau, who is a very renowned physicalist, and he thinks that people resist physicalism because we have this persistent intuition of dualism. And I have argued that something like revelation is actually giving us an irrational explanation for our intuition of dualism. So I think, people usually take Papineau's view on the intuitiveness of revelation. But as a physicalist, you would have to deny that revelation is true, despite its intuitiveness.
I see. So you can admit it's intuitive, but then somehow diagnose why that intuition is misplaced or rooted in an illusion. Or, I mean, this connects, people might be familiar with Keith Frankish arguing for an illusionist position, that there's something misguided in way ordinary people, or at least philosophers, form these intuitions. So this might be one way of articulating an illusionist theory of consciousness, to admit that yes, we ordinarily find this revelation intuition plausible, intuitive, but actually it's confused. So how do they do this? Is there any way in which a physicalist has spelt out whereby the confusion lies? Whereby, is that a word? Wherein the confusion lies.
Yeah, I think there are different proposals, right? So let me just give you a kind of one simple approach, right? So what explains the intuitiveness of a revelation? So for anti-physicalists, what is the truth of revelation? Very simple, right? And for physicalists, they probably want to, in order to defend their position, defend against the revelation argument, they will have to give some other story to account for the intuitiveness. So one thing one might say is that, a revelation theorists say that the nature of our conscious experience just appear to us, so it manifests itself, right? And a physicalist can say that this appearance is systematically misleading, right? There's a kind of systematic misrepresentation of the nature, of the qualitative nature of our feelings, right? So I think perhaps a very useful analogy to use is perceptual representation of colors, right? So think about what colors are, right? Naively, the common sense view is that colors are properties of objects, of surfaces of objects. And so, red has a particular qualitative character, appears in a certain way. Green appears in a certain way, and the nature of green and the nature of red seem to be different, but they manifest through the appearances. So you can have a revelation thesis about colors as well, right? So as a physicalist about color, they will have to say that colors are just these microphysical properties of surfaces. So colors are surface reflectance properties, right? But they appear to have this nature because our perceptual system sort of creates this illusion, right? So we have perceptual experience that misrepresents the nature of colors, right? But so there's this experience in us, and we have a color experiences, but really colors are not what we take them to be. Okay, so then you have so this is perceptual misrepresentation of colors. So in the case of a conscious experience, a physicalist can say that, so we're not dealing with the perception anymore, we're dealing with introspection. So we use introspection. Introspection is the method through which we know about our conscious experiences. So then a physicalist can say that there's a systematic introspective misrepresentation of the nature of our conscious experience, right? So conscious experience is systematically misrepresented by our introspection. So I think there can be some elaborate stories to be told about introspective misrepresentation, but it's a lot harder. I think, in the case of consciousness, it really resists imagination. So in the case of colors, we can sort of understand the idea. It's not so hard to imagine. Maybe the world is not colorful, really. Colors are just projections of our visual system. But then you're telling me my experiences are not like what they appear to be, and it's just projection of what another second order experience, right? And then what about the second order experience? Does it not have a qualitative character? Does that mean there's a third order experience? So there's a kind of worry of infinite regress. But and then the argument gets really complicated, and I'm sure illusionists have sort of put forward a way of making sense of this better than I can. So, yeah.
That's really interesting. That's very helpful, that analogy. It's reminding me a little, Keith Frankish had a published article responding to me called, I think it was called Galileo's Real Error. So I've written a book arguing, this important conceptual innovation in the scientific revolution where, rather than thinking, as Aristotle did, of there's colours out there on the surfaces of objects, Galileo strips the world of its colours and also its sounds and smells and tastes, sticks them in consciousness, and then we can just describe everything in mathematics, start of mathematical physics. So on the way I think about things, okay, these qualities, it's not that they don't exist, it's just that now they're in consciousness. But then what you're suggesting the illusionist might say is apply the same thing again, and that's what Keith does. He says, well, no, it's a mistake to think the qualities exist even in the mind. They don't exist at all. They are the result of a sort of misrepresentation and misperception of what is essentially just patterns of neural firings. Yeah, but as you say, it does seem, and I think people will feel this, it does seem harder to make that move in the consciousness case. Is it to do with the fact that we seem to have some special certainty about our own conscious states? I mean, going back to Descartes,
I think it's just really hard to conceive a appearance reality distinction,
right,
when it comes to our conscious experience. So right, with most things in our environment, well, maybe not most, but with many things in our natural environment, at least, natural categories like water and animals like tigers and pandas, we tend to assume that these categories have kind of hidden essence, right? Psychologists call this tendency we have psychological essentialism, right? So we definitely, with natural kinds, we have this kind of tendency to assume that natural kinds have hidden essences. But we sometimes even extend this tendency to social categories as well. We even assume that social kinds, certain groups of people have hidden essences, which causally explain, these kind of appearance properties, behavioral properties of the category. So psychological essentialism applies to many categories, I think. And I think, in the case of color, it's not hard to conceive an appearance reality distinction with respect to colors, right? But I think when it comes to conscious experiences, it really resists imagination. It's really hard, at least for me, it's very hard to conceive any distinction between appearance and reality. And as maybe there's some kind of innate inability to draw this distinction. Maybe some people are better at others at drawing this distinction, but I think there's probably a general tendency not to draw a distinction between appearance and reality when it comes to conscious experience.
Brilliant. So the core of this might be, how can we make sense of an appearance reality distinction when it comes to consciousness itself, which is, I suppose, how things appear to us? How can we make sense of appearance reality when the reality in question is how things appear? And again, this is making me think, it might be useful to people listening or watching to draw connections, going back to the very influential work of Saul Kripke, his book Naming and Necessity, which is interesting because both sides of the physicalism, anti-physicalism debate draw inspiration from Kripke in ways we can go into if we had all day. But, I mean, he does give a sort of very rough and ready argument against physicalism, and it's something along these lines. He starts off talking about colors or water or these things science tries to identify the nature of. And there's a sort of appearance reality distinction, right? It's how water appears to us, colorless, odorless, in lakes and falling from the sky and stuff. And then its reality, what it really is, being H2O, right? Lightning, its appearance is flashing in the sky, but what its reality is electrical discharge. But then he comes to pain, the feeling of pain. Oh, what's the appearance of the feeling of pain? Well, it's how it feels. What's the reality? Well, it's how it feels. It just doesn't seem to make sense. Yeah.
That's right. And Kripke is certainly not the only one. So, many of your audience, I imagine, would know Thomas Nagel's paper, What It's Like to Be a Bat. So there's actually a section in that paper where Nagel talks about whether it makes sense to think that experiences have an objective reality beyond how they appear to us. So he asks this question, does it make sense, let me find a quote, does it make sense to think that my experiences have a reality beyond how they appear to me? So that's not, you really find this idea in many philosophers, John Searle as well, and even physicalists can agree that there is this strong intuition that there's no appearance reality distinction. I think something like Revelation really fundamentally captures this intuition we have about consciousness, that when it comes to conscious experience, there's just no appearance reality distinction.
I think there are some philosophers who would just deny that this revelation, not only that it's true, but that it's part of ordinary thought. In fact, just yesterday I was arguing with Lance Bush on Substack instead of getting my book finished. And his view is just, the way you anti-physicalists think about consciousness, very contrived. It's just sort of made up by philosophers. It's not how ordinary people think about things. So he's not even conceding that it's intuitive and then saying why it's confused. But it's just totally made up by philosophers. But actually, Michelle, you jog my memory that this is one of your important contributions to this literature, is arguing positively that revelation is part of, and it is an intuition ordinary people have. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's right. So obviously, we don't use the term in ordinary English. We don't use this term revelation to capture our intuition, right? And also philosophers, by consciousness, they mean something quite special as well. So the argument I put forward is a kind of a linguistic argument. So it draws on data on our linguistic intuitions about certain sentences. Okay. So I can give you these sentences. I'll give you two pairs of the sentences. And so I want you to think about whether these sentences sound odd, whether they make sense, right? Bearing in mind that we've been discussing about essence and appearance for a long time, so maybe your intuition might not be quite what I wanted to get at, but I've done experiments on this as well. I've gathered empirical data. So here are the two pairs. So first sentence, I know what gold looks like, but I don't know what gold really is. Is that an okay sentence?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah. Second sentence, I know what an itch feels like, but I don't know what the feeling of itch really is. Okay, so the second sentence is a lot odder than the first one. So I've done experiments on people, and ordinary English speakers tend to say that the first sentence is acceptable, whereas the second sentence is odd. Definitely a lot odder than the first one, right? So why is the case that when it comes to something like itch, people find the sentence sort of doesn't make sense? Here's another pair. So this time it's a kind of question form. First sentence, you have all seen diamonds, but do you know what a diamond really is?
Sounds good.
That's an okay question to ask, right? You have all experienced toothaches, but do you know what the feeling of a toothache really is? Again, people judge the second sentence to be a lot odder than the first one, right? Yeah. I think this has something to do with the revelation. So just focusing on the first pair, I know what gold looks like, but I don't know what gold really is. I know what an itch feels like, but I don't know what the feeling of an itch really is. So really, I'm trying to get this appearance reality distinction between how something appears and then what that thing really is, right? So this phrase, I know what something really is, can actually have different meanings. But one salient reading is that when someone says, they know what something really is. They're claiming that they know the hidden essence, the sort of hidden nature of that thing. So think about this sentence. Every 10-year-old knows what gold looks like. Claire, who has memorized the periodic table, knows what gold really is, right? So what does she know? Well, she knows the scientific definition of gold. She knows the hidden kind of scientific, the kind of nature of gold, right? In virtue of knowing the scientific definition. So I think this is what people often mean when they say they know what something really is. So in the case of gold, it's perfectly fine to say something, you know what something looks like, you know what gold looks like, but you don't know what gold really is. But in the case of an itch, this becomes really weird. I think that if you assume something like revelation, and when you approach these sentences, right? If someone says, I know what an itch feels like, given revelation, they ought to know the nature of that feeling, right? And then to go on to say that they don't know the nature of that feeling, I don't know what the feeling of itch really is on this kind of essence reading, nature reading, it's just, the person is contradicting themselves, right? So the second part of the sentence sort of contradicts the first part. So really, I think the oddness of these sentences about experiences can be, my argument is the oddness can be best explained by the hypothesis that revelation is part of our ordinary conception of experience, which people draw on when they implicitly draw on when they sort of assess the oddness of these sentences.
That's fascinating. So you've not just been doing the usual philosopher thing, sitting in your armchair and assuming your intuitions correspond to what the masses think. This is the kind of thing Lance Bush, for example, gets really annoyed about. But you've actually been going out and doing empirical work, exploring, investigating.
Also just to satisfy reviewers as well. I had 4 reviewers for that paper. Some were not convinced by my armchair argument initially, so I had to gather some data. Yeah.
Oh, so did that result from a revise and resubmit? Which, in case people don't know it, if you try and publish in a journal,
which took 18 months.
Right. Oh my gosh. So yeah, revise, just in case people aren't familiar with the peer review system. You submit to a journal. You wait a million years, then they revise and resubmit. They say, oh, you've got to make these huge changes and we might accept it. And then you make them and then they say, no, that's sorry.
Right. Yeah, it was the beginning of my career as well. I just finished my PhD, so I was desperate to get a publication, and that was one of my early publications. Yeah.
Right. Well, it's good, very interesting results. And actually, it reminded me, people might be interested. I'll put the link in the description. You were on Mind Chat, sort of discussing with Edward Macquarie, who's also done what's become known as experimental philosophy, which is not sort of doing, experiments with particle colliders or something, is trying to investigate people's intuitions in this way. So he's on the other side of the debate, thinking the anti-physicalist way of thinking about consciousness is not connected to ordinary thought, whereas you're arguing that it is. But I should provide the link for that. Just, I suppose what one hesitation people might have, and with what you've been saying, and this comes up to me a lot, again, wasting too much time arguing on X or whatever, but a lot of people say, well, okay, you're saying we know the nature of consciousness. Well, tell me what it is. Tell me what is the essence of pain. What is the essence of seeing red? And, famously, you can't kind of say, as Louis Armstrong said about jazz famously, if you have to ask, you'll never know. So people might then say, be a bit suspicious. Okay, you're making these grand claims that we know the nature of consciousness, but when I ask you, well, what is it? You just sort of can't give an answer. How would you respond to someone with that worry?
So I think knowledge can take various forms, right? So the person wants you to have a kind of a sentence, a proposition that summarizes your knowledge, right? So to ask you to come up with a kind of a sentence that summarizes the nature of conscious experience that right? So I think the knowledge we have is kind of indescribable to some extent, at least. Well, again, focusing on simple experiences, right? So going back to the feeling of being stung by a jellyfish, I said, well, I don't really know how to describe the experience, or it's definitely, it's a bit like a bee sting, but it's not quite the same, right? And I'll struggle And I think I would be tempted to use a kind of demonstrative. It's like that, but pointing inward to my experience, right? And this that is supposed to be a placeholder for this kind of rich knowledge we have. And I think there can be all sorts of knowledge that we can't really put into words. Know-how is lots of instances of know-how can't be put into words. I know how to swim, but if you ask me, what's this knowledge? Can you describe it? I don't know how, but does that mean that I don't possess the knowledge? Obviously not, right? I think, knowledge of our conscious experience is a bit like that. It sort of resists description.
Right. So you just sort of directly apprehend the character of the experience. You know it when you see it, even if you can't communicate that. I mean, that certainly does. See, it certainly is how it seems. And that is, in my experience, at least intuitive to many people. Like, talking to undergraduate philosophy students for decades, and lots of philosophy concepts they find difficult, and you have to sort of approach it from different angles. You start talking about consciousness in the ways you've been talking about, people get it straight away. Well, actually, David Lewis, people might not know David Lewis, but very influential 20th century philosopher. He has a very interesting little paper called Should Materialists Believe in Qualia? And he says the word qualia, although it's not an ordinary language term, he says ordinary people have a concept of it, because his evidence for that is they get onto it so quickly. And in fact, he was one of the first people articulating, not with this term, but this revelation intuition. He says this is part of the folk understanding, and he says materialists have to deny this. Now, does that mean consciousness doesn't exist, qualia don't exist, or they do exist? And he says you could kind of go either way. It's maybe a little bit like free will. If you think our ordinary concept of free will is more sort of libertarian, and then you find out determinism is true, do you say there's no free will? Do you say there is, but it's different to what we thought? Maybe go either way. There's a bit of flexibility here. I suppose that is how the illusionists might think of consciousness. Yeah, this revelation stuff is kind of true of our ordinary concept, but it's a confused intuition. But okay, is there another option for the physicalist to denying it revelation? Is there not? Because it does seem very intuitive, or at least to me, viewers and listeners can make their own minds up. Is there an option for the physicalist to say, yeah, you're right, we grasp the essence of consciousness introspectively, a feeling is defined by how it feels, and you know how it feels when you feel it, but physicalism is still true, that feelings just are patterns of neural firings? Is there a way of squaring that circle?
So some people argue for a dew carving view, and that's I think what you have argued against in your work as well. So dew carving, I think, roughly is this idea that fine, you have a kind of first personal subjective way of understanding our conscious experience that reveals its essence, but you can also have a physicalist kind of third personal way of understanding conscious experience that also reveals its essence. So two different conceptions that both independently reveal the essence. Is that the right way to capture?
Yeah, that sounds right to me. That's my term. That I made that up. Jewel carving, just a bit of credit there to myself. But yeah, that seems the right way of thinking about it. That there are two radically different ways of understanding the nature of something. And Henry Taylor, I think, has argued against me on these terms. Who else? I'm sure there are a few. It seems to be a less popular view. But it is one option to say, yes, you completely understand what pain is when you know how it feels, but yes, you also completely understand what pain is when you think about it as a pattern of neural firings. These are just two radically different ways of understanding the nature of a single entity. Okay, so what's wrong with that?
I think it's quite arbitrary. It's a kind of ad hoc position, but I'm sure, Henry and other physicalists have come up with a very sophisticated metaphysical picture about this. I think when we think about lots of things, there are lots of things we can have multiple conceptions of, right? So you can think of water as being H2O. You can think of water as this thing that comes out of our taps, right? But in these cases, only one conception reveals the essence, right? The scientific conception reveals the essence of water, and this conception that says water comes out of our tap doesn't really reveal the essence of water. But so lots of physicalists take that to be the model of consciousness, right? So many physicalists would say that the subjective perspective actually doesn't reveal the essence. It's really the physicalist kind of perspective. Whereas Jew carving proponents want to say that both conceptions reveal the essence. So do we have other examples apart from consciousness? I think it's really hard to think of another example. So going back to the example of a triangle. What's a triangle? A triangle is a closed shape with three sides, right? That looks like a good definition, good way of defining triangle that reveals the nature of a triangle. But here's another way of thinking about triangles. So a triangle is a closed shape with three angles, right? That's a different conception. And that's also a very good definition. But in that case, the two definitions are kind of they're not conceptually independent. Someone who understands the first definition can also understand why the second definition is also true. So one definition follows from the other, right? And vice versa, right? As long as you know what angles are, what sides are, you can see that if a triangle is a closed shape with three sides, then it's also a closed shape with three angles. So these two conceptions are not conceptually independent. So in the case of a dew carving, we're dealing with an example where the two conceptions are really conceptually independent. So if, when you tell me, okay, so the feeling of a pen is this, and this subjective thing, and there's also this kind of physicalist perspective, but these two perspectives, I still have this remaining puzzle, whereas I don't have any puzzle once I learn the two definitions of what a triangle is. So I think the consciousness case is very, very bizarre, is kind of ad hoc and arbitrary. It would be good to have some other examples.
Yeah, I've mocked it in some places, calling it Trinitarian physicalism. So it's like, there's the famous paradox of the Trinity. Is God is Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and they're different, but they're not different. Christians will be happy to admit that's hard to make sense of. But it's almost like so I guess it's binitarianism rather than Trinitarianism. But the physicist saying, yeah, it is a pattern in neural firings, that's its complete nature, and it is how it feels, that's its complete nature, but these are totally different. Yeah, it sort of seems paradoxical.
They seem totally different, and there's a remaining question, so what exactly is the nature, right?
Yeah. At least you've got to say this is very different to other scientific identities, because, as you gestured at there, with other scientific identities, before you do the science, you don't know the nature of the thing. Lightning, what the hell is lightning? Is it Thor's anger? What the hell is water? You do the science, you know what it is. But with consciousness, at least these physicalists who we're now talking about, before we do any science, we already know what it is. You know what a feeling is when you feel it. And then, so what are we doing science to learn? Yeah, I don't even like, a lot of the popular discussions of consciousness say, we don't know what consciousness is. That's the mystery. Nobody knows what consciousness... No, we know what consciousness is. You know what a feeling is when you feel it. It's, the mystery. There's a mystery here, how it fits into what we know about the world more generally. But what it is, that's not a mystery. Are there counterexamples? I'm just thinking, Essa Diaz-Leon, a physicalist, has responded to me with some putative counterexamples. Now, I think one thing she noticed was errors I'd made in my putative examples. I think I talked of a bachelor as being an unmarried man or an unmarried male, and then we grasped the essence of that just through having the concept. And she pointed out, well, no, what is a man? What is a male? Is this biological? Is this something to do with chromosomes? Is this something to do with a social construction? Whichever way you go, it's not obvious that falls out of the concept of a bachelor. So I think she correctly identified some errors in some of my articles, but now I can't remember now. So maybe I shouldn't have started this. I can't remember what putative. So does anybody try to? Well, Henry Taylor's alleged counterexample is supposed to be qualities and causal powers. Don't want to get too technical. So let's
rely on a very elaborate kind of metaphysical system about how you think about the relationship between qualities. dispositions.
Yeah.
And that's one view among many different views on, disposition and qualities.
So what would be an example of sphericity? I mean, my colleague John Hyle is famous, I guess, for this idea of the powerful qualities view, that properties are both qualities and causal powers. So sphericity, we can think of it as a quality, so having a spherical shape, all points on a surface equidistant from the center. But we can also think of it in terms of what it does, its powers, it's rolling along the ground. I think that's the example it gives. So there's two ways of understanding the nature. Is that a good example?
I think that would be so that would be an example if you buy into this idea that the qualitative character of a sphere is just its dispositional profile. And then there's a question about whether that applies in the case of our conscious experience, right? So in the case of sphericity, I think it's kind of tangible. You can understand why it's not completely bizarre. There's no remaining puzzlement. I think in the case of consciousness, there's always this remaining puzzlement. How, these two things which just looked utterly different, how can they be conceptions that converge on the same thing? There's always, I think, a remaining puzzlement. And this is maybe just the intuition of dualism.
Right. Well, I think we've certainly, hopefully, raised some of the big challenges for physicalism here, if not conclusively ruled it out. And I'd be interested to hear from physicalists listening or watching to this, where they think this argument goes wrong, or how they would respond to this argument. Maybe we can have Essa Diaz-Leon on to respond to that. But so what we've focused on this whole discussion so far is revelation as a problem for physicalism. Maybe we could end there, well, where does this leave us? And I'm sure you'll agree, Michelle, for any right-minded person, this makes you a panpsychist, right? Obviously, physicalism is false. You're a panpsychist, of course. I mean, we could maybe just end it there.
I don't think I can say that.
What?
I don't think I can. I don't think I can say that I'm an anti-physicalist. I certainly can't say I'm a physicalist, right? I don't think I can say I'm an anti-physicalist either. I think I'm someone who just doesn't know. Well, maybe I just can't make up my mind about the metaphysics of mind. So I always have the intuition of dualism. Right, I find dualism really, really intuitive. And I think the intuition of dualism fundamentally, at least among philosophers and even, ordinary people as well who have thought about this problem, I think it has something to do with revelation. There's no appearance reality distinction. But at another level, I also find physicalism very intuitive. It's such an elegant theory, very simple theory, right? So I'm always torn. So I studied. The first time I studied consciousness, metaphysical mind, philosophy of mind really, was in my second year of my master's program. And the text I read at the time, which influenced me a lot, was David Chalmers' The Conscious Mind. So I've got the book here, right? So I've always had the intuition of dualism. And I don't always have the kind of received intuitions that philosophers have about thought experiments. But with knowledge arguments, zombie argument, I had no problem. I just had the right intuition straight away, the received intuition straight away. But so there's something else about Chalmers' book. So it's not in the content of the book. There's this little blurb at the back of the book written by David Lewis, which really struck me at the time when I was reading the book. But I think it still stays with me. And maybe I can read it out and try to articulate why I can't make up my mind. So this is what Lewis says, just praising Chalmers' book. The Conscious Mind is exceptionally ambitious and exceptionally successful, the best book in philosophy of mind for many years. It flies in the face of fashion, because physicalism was the fashionable position to take, making a formidable case against materialist orthodoxy. Legions of materialists, i.e. physicalists, are no doubt busy writing their rejoinders, but there will be few points left for them to make that Chalmers hasn't made already. We of the materialist opposition cannot go on about how he has overlooked this and misunderstood that, because he hasn't. Now, this is the important sentence. All we can do is to disagree about which way the balance of consideration tilts. So it almost sounds like it comes down to kind of aesthetic taste. And it is interesting to know that many philosophers who are associated with Australia, Lewis included, except Chalmers, many philosophers who are associated, who are from Australia, really love Australia, they tend to be physicalists. So lots of names, David Armstrong, Shoemaker, Sidney Shoemaker, J.J.C. Smart, and Frank Jackson as well. Definitely the second half of Frank Jackson. And so, is there something to do with, Australia, such that these philosophers have a particular taste, for sparse ontology, the sparseness of Australia? And so I think, why someone like Chalmers tilts the balance towards dualism and Lewis tilts the balance towards physicalism. I just don't know where my balance is, I just don't know how to tilt the balance. I think in a way it's a kind of intellectual insecurity about my own intuitions. But put it nicely, it's a kind of intellectual humility, right? But it's kind of, I have very strong intuitions, and I can see various considerations on both sides, right, for both positions. But I just can't make up my mind, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think, for me, metaphysics is really hard. I don't think I can ever come to any conclusions about what the world is like. But I think, we can study what we think the world is like. And that's not easy either. You probably have to do some empirical work, do some serious thinking, right? Because you don't always know what you think the world is like until you have really reflected on it. And I think at the end of this whole process, once you understood all different philosophical arguments, it's possible that you just don't know where you stand on the debate, which side of the debate you are on. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because, some philosophers, like you, who do theory building, right? You build a very elaborate, sophisticated theory of the world and theory of mind, right? That's really admirable and interesting. But there's also another kind of philosophy, you find it in Wittgenstein, even in Kant as well, this kind of treating philosophy as a kind of problem-solving activity, right? So this way of thinking about philosophy is really driven by a kind of a fundamental desire to understand philosophical disagreements. And so in my recent work, in the kind of work I now do these days, I sort of think about how philosophical disagreements arise through the lens of language, through the lens of how words can have multiple different but related meanings, right? Polysemous words. In the case of consciousness, it doesn't really have too much to do with language, at least, the debate about the nature of consciousness, but it has something to do with how seriously philosophers take their intuitions to be, I think, intuitive evidence to be. I think and this can depend on what kind of philosophical system you have, and even the rest of your worldview. So if you're very scientifically minded, then you're likely to discount your intuition with dualism, right? But if you're someone who thinks consciousness is very special, and we are very special, and consciousness is what makes us special, then you're likely, I'm simplifying this, but I think you're likely to have the tendency to take your intuition about revelation very seriously.
This is so interesting. So many things popping up in my head. Just on Chalmers' book, The Conscious Mind. Yeah, it's this year. It's the 20th anniversary of the publication of that book. And David Chalmers is going to come onto this channel at some point. Just trying to fix a date to discuss that 20-year anniversary and what's changed and so on. Wow. On David Lewis, what a wonderful expression of the humility and the uncertainty and the... He's an interesting David Lewis because he's so famous in analytic philosophy, but nobody outside of academic analytic philosophy has ever heard of him. People say he's a sort of philosopher's philosopher. I was just a little bit slightly too young to ever meet him. He died early 21st century. Died a little bit young in his early 60s, I think. The first connection I had was just attending just after he died. His widow Steffi, who's a lovely person who I didn't know quite well, read out his final paper posthumously, which was connected to Ramsey and humility, kind of connected to the panpsychism stuff I defend. Anyway, let's not get off on a tangent. But she read out it was a very peculiar event in a way. In Oxford, she read out his final paper, and Timothy Williamson answered questions on it. I met P.F. Strawson at that, very big philosopher.
Oh, wow.
at that who was the father of my supervisor, Galen Strawson, a very different kind of philosopher. Anyway, no, but well, that's fascinating. Your answer surprised me. I guess I thought you were going to be a dualist or an anti-physicalist, and I mean, could you say a little? So, I think you've made a very good case for revelation. Can you say a little bit about what counterbalances that in favor of physicalism? I mean, you said something about science there. I suppose I would want to push back a little bit about that. I guess I'm inclined to think, and I argue this a lot, keep coming back to it. People are going to think my whole career is arguing on X. That it's physicalism is essentially connected to the science. I would reject that. I think the science is just neutral. The science tells us which kinds of brain activity go along with which kinds of conscious experience, or at least that's what it's aspired to do, and I hope it does. There's no consensus at the moment. But but then the philosophical question is, well, why is certain kinds of physical activity correlated with consciousness? The dualist has one answer, the physicalist have another, the panpsychists have another. So I would just reject this idea that, sciencey people are going to go for physicalism. So could you either defend that a little bit more, or what counterbalances revelation to tempt you to physicalism?
I think, just the kind of general considerations of simplicity, elegance, everything else is physical, right? Once upon a time, we thought life was special, right? And there's nothing too special about life. We can explain the various processes of a life formation, right? I think there is the sense that, why should we think that consciousness is special, is different? And I mean, trust me, I certainly think consciousness is special. But on the other hand, when you just compare consciousness to other things and put them on the same level, and then you have this feeling, why should we think that consciousness is special? Are we missing something? So I have that kind of humility there. I think a physicalist like David Papin would say that perhaps that he wouldn't say that it's in the science business to explain consciousness, because we've already got enough evidence to show that conscious experiences are just physical process because of correlation, right? There's systematic, beautiful correlations between the brain and our experiences. So what explains this correlation? The simplest explanation is that they just want the same thing. So I think that's something that Papineau probably would think, right? And so then again, if you are anti-physicalist, the response is that that's not enough. The mere correlation isn't enough, and we can't just because this consciousness just seems so different from brain processes. And then you have the argument from revelation. So yeah, that's my response.
I've got to ask this question, Michelle. Why not panpsychism? Doesn't that allow for this intuition as well? Because consciousness is not special, or at least our consciousness is not special. It's just something. Our consciousness is just a highly evolved form of a simple property that fills the universe. It's elegant, simple. You're not adding consciousness, I would say, as a panpsychist to the scientific story. You're saying it underlies the scientific story from physical science, so it's a sort of mirror image of physicalism. So rather than starting with the physical and trying to get consciousness out, you do it the other way around. It's very simple forms of consciousness at the base of reality, and both our consciousness and the story of physical science emerge from that. Isn't that a way of accommodating revelation and the simplicity and elegance that go with a physicalist intuition?
I think some people will worry whether panpsychism accommodates the intuition of revelation, right? So you've obviously argued for the compatibility between the two, but I think there's a kind of residual worry there, because panpsychism is this idea, our conscious experiences are kind of really complicated, has this complex structure which can be broken down into, these simpler parts. whereas our experience doesn't reveal that complex structure, right? So there's this kind of initial tension, right? And I think I haven't really solved that quandary yet. and also, panpsychism comes with a very kind of elaborate metaphysical system as well, right? And you have these simpler qualia, simpler consciousness, and then you have these complex consciousness. I think, again, it's maybe just to do with my taste. I just don't, I can't really know how to tilt the balance. I think, I can definitely see the appeal of panpsychism. But at the same time, I can see the appeal of physicalism. I can see the appeal of dualism. And then, making up my mind is something I don't seem to be able to do in this debate.
Oh, that's good. Well, I'm glad we touched on, not good that you can't make your mind up, although it's you just demonstrating a wonderful humility. But I think it's good we touched on there's a potential worry for a panpsychist here as well. I think there is an article came out recently pushing this line that, yeah, we've been talking about this as a problem for physicalism, but suppose you're a panpsychist and you think my consciousness is not purely physical, not explicable in the terms of physical science, but it is explicable in terms of simple interactions of simple forms of consciousness, conscious particles grouping together make my consciousness. So certainly someone like Luke Rolofs, who I'd love to have a chat with on this channel at some point, has that very reductive story of panpsychism. And this might be a worry because I attend to my consciousness and it doesn't seem to reveal to me these trillions of conscious particles bumping into each other. So yeah, David Papineau has pressed this on me in personal discussion. Yeah, that's a good point. Go on.
I wanted to say that another David Lewis, in the paper you mentioned, should a materialist believe in qualia? He's got the section, talking about the simplicity of qualia. So he thinks that it follows from revelation, which he calls the identity thesis. It follows from revelation that qualia are simple in the sense, when we observe, or at least, again, I mentioned we should start with a simple example, looking at a particular shade of blue or having a particular sensation. When we focus on these examples, it does look like, these experiences seem to have very simple they look simple. They look like they don't have structures. So if revelation is true, there's a temptation to say that at least many instances of phenomenal properties, many instances of experiences are actually simple.
Yeah.
And that's obviously a problem for physicalism as well, because, if your pain is some complicated neurophysiological process, then, experiences can't be simple.
Yeah, so we've sort of come full circle, connected. David Lewis has popped up a lot in this discussion, hasn't he? And it might be interesting for people who haven't heard of David Lewis to see how connected he is to all of these discussions. Well, yeah, I think so. I want to get on this channel a mixture of people I agree with and I disagree with. I guess we've had a lot of agreement here on at least sympathies for this revelation argument. It would be good to get on both a physicalist, maybe Esther Diaz-Leon, to see how they would respond to this challenge, but also a panpsychist, a very reductive panpsychist like Luke Rolofs, to see how they respond to this revelation challenge as it occurs for panpsychism. I suppose just kind of bringing things to a close, in terms of kind of my own contribution to this literature, going back maybe 15, 17 years now. I'm a little bit older than you, Michelle, getting old now, middle-aged, in my late 40s now. It's a bit depressing. But
You're
anyway,
always young in your heart.
Yeah, but that's feeling old, is it? No, I'm feeling young and sprightly.
I first met you when I was a graduate student, so that was 2016. So that's 10 years ago.
Right.
I think you haven't changed at all. So yeah.
Oh,
Your manners definitely haven't changed, and I don't think your appearance has either. So that's great.
That's very kind. You can come on again with the flattery. I like it. I've got losing more hair all the time. But when did we meet? What was the first? Was it a conference?
When you were at Budapest CEU.
Yes.
Summer school.
That was my job before Durham, Central European University. They have wonderful summer schools people might be interested in if you're a philosophy graduate student or undergraduate even. And well, actually, I've just got a new postdoc just started who I met at one of those summer schools. So yeah, that was really fun, and oh wow, so many connections from that. Yeah, so in terms of my own contributions to discussions, I suppose I've argued that this revelation business is really what's at the core of these arguments against physicalism. So you've got all these different arguments, the zombie argument, and David Chalmers pushes that with his two-dimensional semantic framework, very complicated as a kind of backdrop to that. You've got Frank Jackson's knowledge argument. It's been discussed a lot this week on my Substack and so on. But I guess what I've tried to push is really this revelation stuff is the core of it. You know, if revelation is true, if we do grasp the nature of consciousness introspectively, then it's sort of a slam dunk. We don't need these kind of icing on the cake of zombies or black and white Mary or whatever. Whereas if on to the contrary, revelation is false, then there is no case against physicalism. You know, if we have absolutely no idea of the nature of consciousness until we do the science. I mean, I think David Papineau's view used to be like this. It used to be just when you're thinking about your pain in terms of how it feels, you just sort of pointing at something. Turns out to be a brain state. You don't know what the hell you're pointing at. I mean, you know, metaphorically, you're not literally using your fingers, but you've evolved a capacity to sort of point at something inside yourself. You don't know what it is. Turns out it's a brain state. So if that were true, it doesn't sound to me a very plausible account of our concepts of our experience. But if revelation were false, then there would be no case against physicalism. So I sort of think I tried to press that, you know, we should be just debating revelation. Forget zombies and Mary and so on. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm quite sympathetic to that. I think, you know, certainly there's value to the knowledge argument, the zombie argument, and I think in the case of Kripke, Kripke's conceivability argument, in the case of feeling pain and the C fibers firing, you would naturally think that he probably had assumed something like revelation or no appearance of reality distinction. That's why, you know, he thinks it doesn't make sense to draw a distinction between what pain is and what pain feels like, right? So I think one way to think about it is that maybe, going back to my point that revelation is part of our folk conception of experience, maybe we have these intuitions, these dualistic intuitions about the knowledge argument, zombie argument, because we're implicitly assuming something like revelation, although we're not consciously aware of the fact that we are drawing on revelation. I think that's a kind of empirical point, and that's a plausible hypothesis.
Okay, we can end on a point of agreement. So this has been nice. There's been a lot of agreement, a bit of disagreement, and then coming back to agreement and harmony. And Michelle, I think this has been going to be really helpful to a lot of people. Do you know, actually, my academic work has focused on pushing this revelation, but actually in popular work, I've never really talked about it. I thought it was too complicated, but I actually think that was a mistake. And I prompted by actually Ralph Weir, who's a very good dualist philosopher, on Joe Schmidt's channel, explaining the revelation argument, and I was thinking, why haven't I been doing this for the last 10 years or whatever? And so maybe this is the time.
Revelation is very scary, I think.
I remember just another quick anecdote. I remember arguing with David Papineau in a conference in Helsinki outside a bar at 3 a.m. about revelation, and he was just gesturing to me violently with his beer bottle, going, it's religious, and beer was splashing out at me. And anyway, happy days.
Association, you know, that's a different meaning.
But yeah, maybe it's the time to take revelation to the masses, and I think you've been a really good way of opening up people to the idea. Is there anything you would like to share about your own? Do you have a website, Michelle, or anything? What do you?
Yeah, I do have a website. So I work at Monash University in Melbourne, and I've got my personal website. I've got a university departmental website. So my interest is always in philosophy of mind and the philosophy of language, kind of intersection between the two. And so I came into philosophy from linguistics, very, very influenced by Wittgenstein. And so nowadays I do a lot of philosophy of language, but I'm writing on something on the impoverishment of language when it comes to describing experiences. So that's something I'm working on. I'm working on basically words with multiple meanings, so polysemous words, and how polysemy can feature in various debates, philosophical debates, and can give rise to disagreements. And yeah, so that's the kind of things I'm working on. Still thinking about consciousness, but also thinking about language, which is kind of my true passion. I'm a failed linguist, so yeah.
That's interesting. Well, it's wonderful the way you combine the two. I think a lot of philosophers are failed mathematicians or failed physicists, and or maybe it can go the other way around. I think it's wonderful when you can bring these two disciplines into communication with each other, and you're doing some great work at it. So keep it up.
Philosophy is a lot more fun than linguistics. It's not like I tried linguistics and failed. It's just part of me is a wannabe linguist, but linguistics is kind of boring at the same wash. Don't include that. But it's kind of, tedious, depends on the kind of linguistics you do. But you can do certain kind of linguistics that's pretty much philosophy of language, but more interesting than typical philosophy of language.
Right.
If you know what I mean. Yeah.
Right. No, that makes sense. My colleague James Miller is pioneering the metaphysics of words. What is a word? What is the nature of a word?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
lots of interesting connections there too.
Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of people are going to be fascinated by the discussion. I'm very interested to hear what people think of this revelation argument. Michelle, thank you so much for coming on and explaining it to us.
And thank you for having me.